The first thing Myra Vasquez learned about the galaxy's deadliest predator was that it was afraid of her. Not of her rifle, not of her suit, of her. She found that out 3 minutes after it killed the rest of her crew. The thing had a body the size of a city block and an eye the color of old amber, and it had moved through the chamber the way weather moves through a valley, without hurry, without malice, the way a storm comes down a mountainside, because that is what storms do. It had not seemed to notice her at first. It had been busy. It had been finishing the others. And then, when there were no others left to finish, the great gold eye had turned, and the chamber had gone very quiet, and the thing had looked at the small soft animal pressed against the wall, and the small soft animal had begun, for reasons she could not have explained at the time and could not entirely explain now, to hum. And the thing the galaxy had locked in a cage for 11 billion years, had stopped, had listened, had hummed back. This is the story of what happened next. It is also the story of what happened before, because nothing about what happened next can be understood without knowing what kind of world had sent her there, and what kind of woman she had had to be by the time she got there. So we begin on Earth. We begin in the gray years. Earth had been coughing for 60 years before anyone admitted it was dying. The trees went first, in a slow brown wave that crossed continents like a held breath. Then the grasses. Then the plankton. By the time Myra was old enough to understand the word atmosphere, her mother had already stopped opening the windows. The sky over Bogota had gone the color of old tea, and the rain, when it came warm and slow and tasting of iron. She was 9 when she watched her grandmother burn a Bible, not in anger, in cold. The old woman had fed pages into the kitchen stove one at a time, careful as a priest, and Myra had sat on the tile floor with her knees pulled up and watched Leviticus blacken at the edges and curl. Abuela had hummed while she did it, a lullaby. The same one she used to sing into Myra's hair when the lights went out. Myra would remember the tune for the rest of her life. She would not remember the words. By the time she was 26, half the planet had autoimmune disease and the other half was trying not to catch it. The plants that survived made something the human gut couldn't tell from its own cells. The body ate itself, slow at first, then not. Myra had grown up in the gray years. That was what they called them later, when there was a later, the years when the sky over half the world had been the color of dishwater, and the news every night had been account of forests. So many million hectares, so many billion trees. The numbers had stopped meaning anything around the time she turned 15. The number was always bigger than the day before. The number was the weather report. You read it the way her great-grandparents had read the temperature. Her father had been a botanist. Her father had been one of the men who had stood in the rain in Manaus and watched a thing the size of a country die in front of him, and had come home and not spoken for a month, and had then quietly hanged himself in the garage on a Tuesday morning. Myra had been 12. She had not cried. She had gone to medical school instead. She had told herself at 16, in a bathroom in Cartagena, looking into a mirror under a flickering bulb, that she would never love a thing she could not save. She had broken that promise twice, once with Diego, once with the small 7-week thing inside her, on the morning of the launch. The crew of Gemini were 12, and they were the best the species had left. There was Halvorsen, Norwegian ex-Air Force, a man who had once kept a damaged plane in the air for 9 hours over the North Sea with one engine and a prayer. There was Park, Korean navigator, who could do orbital mechanics in his head and could not, no matter how he tried, learn to play the guitar. There was a Shav Verma, xenolinguist born in Mumbai, raised in Toronto, brilliant in the way that did not seem brilliant until you watched her work for a while and realized she was 3 steps ahead of the room. There was Ito, the engineer, older than the rest of them by a decade, who carried in his wallet, against all the rules, a photograph of a granddaughter who had died at 4 of the autoimmune. There was Brennan, the geologist, the youngest of them, 23, who laughed too loud and meant it. There was Voss, the second pilot who did not laugh at all. There was Castle, who did the cooking when the cooking needed doing. There were 5 others Myra had liked well enough but had not known well enough, and whose faces she would remember the rest of her life, in the order in which the dark took them. The night before launch, the 12 of them had sat on the concrete pad under floodlights and passed around a flask of mezcal Brennan had smuggled in. It was against every protocol. Halvorsen had pretended not to see it. Ito had taken one sip very carefully, the way an old man drinks at a funeral, and had said in his quiet voice, "To the small ones we are leaving behind." They had all drunk to that. Myra had drunk to it twice. She had thought, the second time, of the 7-week thing she was not leaving behind, the small one she was taking with her, and she had felt, for the only time in the long countdown, close to tears. Asha had passed her the flask and looked at her, in that way Asha had, and said, "You okay, Doc?" Myra had nodded. Asha had said, "You are a terrible liar." Myra had not answered that. Myra had handed the flask on to Brennan, who had laughed too loud, and Halvorsen had finally cleared his throat, and they had all gone to bed. Project Gemini was supposed to be the answer. 4 billion years ago, something had come to Earth and seeded it. Nobody knew who. The dig in the Karakum had pulled up a chamber full of machines that hummed when you touched them, machines older than the first cell that had ever divided. One of them was a navigation device. It pointed at a star. So they built a ship. They picked 12 people. They put them in cradles of memory foam and water gel, and they slung the ship through a hole in space the size of a thought, and they sent it after the thing that had made the world. Myra was the medic. She was also 7 weeks pregnant when they boarded. She had told no one. Not Diego, the father, who was on the ground in Houston and would not be on the ground much longer. Not Captain Halvorsen, who would have grounded her in a heartbeat. Not even Asha, her bunkmate, who could read her like print. She had stood in the white-tiled medical bay the night before launch and looked at the little blue cross on the strip and thought calmly, the way you think when the world has already ended. Bad timing. Then she had flushed the strip down the toilet and gone to dinner. The wormhole was not what they had been told to expect. It was not a tunnel. It was not light. It was an absence. A long, cold absence in which Myra felt her own heart slow and then speed and then slow again, and felt she would swear this until the day she died, a hand on her belly. Not a touch, an attention, as if something on the other side had counted them. 12, then 13. She felt the count, and then she felt, and she would never tell anyone this, not Asha, not Diego, not the men in the suits at the debrief. She felt the attention move past the others and settle on her belly, on the small thing inside, the way a person notices a candle in a room full of lamps. The attention had not been unkind. It had been curious and old and a little sad, the way a great-grandmother is sad when she sees a baby that reminds her of one she has lost. The hand, if it was a hand, had stayed on her belly for what felt like a very long time. Then the dark had let them go. Myra had come awake gasping in her cradle. The cradle was wet. She thought for a panicked second that her water had broken, that she had carried the pregnancy further than she had thought, that she was about to lose everything in front of her crew. Then she realized it was sweat, just sweat. The cradle was always wet with sweat coming out of a long jump. Across from her, Asha was unstrapping. Asha looked at her face and stopped. "Myra, I'm fine." "You are not fine." "Asha, I am fine." Asha had looked at her for another long second. Then Asha had nodded once, the way Asha nodded when she filed something for later, and gone forward to the bridge. Myra had sat in the wet cradle for a minute longer with both hands on her belly, listening. The small thing was still there. The small thing was, she thought, although she could not have proved it, still alive. She had stood up, and she had gone forward, and that was when Park had begun to swear. When they came out, the star was wrong. "Halvorsen," that was Park, the navigator, voice gone tight. "Halvorsen, this isn't G-class, this is." "I see it. This isn't the system." I see it, Park. The star outside the porthole was the color of a bruise, purple-black sullen with a corona that flickered like a bad fluorescent. The planet beneath them was the same color, banded with rust and ash, and in the long Terminator line where night met day there were lights. Not cities. Lights. Patterns. Concentric rings of pale green that pulsed like something breathing in its sleep. Tell me those are natural, Halvorsen said. Nobody told him anything. They went down anyway. They had no choice. The fuel for the return jump had to be mined from the planet that had been the plan, on the right planet in the right system, and the equipment didn't care which rocket cracked. They dropped the lander through a sky the color of bruised plum and landed in a canyon that looked like every painting of hell Myra had ever seen as a child. Red walls a kilometer high, a dry riverbed of black glass, a wind that pushed at the lander like a hand testing a door. The air was breathable. That was the first wrong thing. The air was breathable on a planet around a star that should have boiled the oceans off. Somebody, Asha said very quietly into her helmet mic, has been here before us. She was right and she was wrong. Somebody had been there, somebody was still there. The first night they did not sleep. They sat in the lander with the floodlights pointed out into the canyon, and they watched the dark for things that did not come. Brennan made a joke that did not land. Voss cleaned his rifle twice. Ito sat with his hands folded in his lap and looked at the wall the way old men look at walls when they are doing arithmetic with the years. Halvorsen rationed out the coffee. He gave Myra a double pour without saying why, and Myra understood with a small cold drop in her stomach that he knew. He had known for weeks. He had let her come anyway, because the species needed every medic it had, and he had given her a double pour of coffee because that was the only kindness a captain could afford on a planet around the wrong star. Halvorsen, she said very quietly when the others had drifted to their bunks. Don't, Vasquez. I just want to. Don't. He did not look at her, he looked into his coffee. When we go home you tell me, not before. All right. Drink your coffee. She drank her coffee. It was bad. It was, she thought, the best coffee she had ever had. The next morning, Brennan and Ito and two others went out with the geological survey kit. They walked along the canyon floor in the bruised light and they took samples, and they came back at dusk with their helmets full of news. The black glass of the riverbed, Brennan said, was not glass. It was a kind of vitrified soil, very thin, and underneath it, all the way down as far as their ground-penetrating radar could see, there was structure. Walls, rooms. A city, Ito said quietly, the size of Tokyo, buried under the canyon floor. Buried by what? Castle said. Time, Ito said, mostly time. How much time? Ito had looked at his hands. Ito had said, more than we have a number for. That night Brennan got drunk on the medical alcohol. Myra pretended not to notice and stood at the porthole and said to nobody, I want to go home. He said it without drama, the way a child says it at the end of a long day. Nobody answered him. Nobody had an answer. They found the door on the second day. It was set into the canyon wall, 20 meters tall, and it was not a door so much as a wound that had healed over. The stone around it had grown around the metal the way a tree grows around a fence. Park ran his glove along the seam, and the dust came away in flakes the size of his palm. This is old, he said. How old? I don't think we have a number for it. Myra put her own hand on the door. She did not know why. The metal was warm, not sun warm, body warm. She pulled her hand back as if she had been bitten. Halvorsen looked at her. He had the kind of face that did not ask questions out loud. He just waited and people answered. It's warm, she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at the door, and then he looked at the sky, where the bruise of a star was setting behind the canyon wall, and he said the words that would kill 4 of them by morning. Open it. It took 6 hours and a thermite charge and a prayer in 3 languages. The door did not so much open as remember it had been a door. It folded back into the rock, and a wind came out of the dark on the other side that smelled like a hospital and a thunderstorm at the same time. Ozone, antiseptic, and under that, very faint, the smell of something alive. They went in with rifles up. The corridor beyond was not built for them. The ceiling was too high. The floor sloped down at an angle that human feet did not love. Every 50 meters there was a panel set into the wall, and the panels showed, Myra realized, very slowly, as her helmet light caught a creature. The same creature, over and over. A long thing, serpentine, with a fan of feelers at the head and a body that did not seem to decide whether it was made of muscle or of smoke. In some of the panels it was small. In some it was the size of a building. In some it was curled around a planet like a cat around a ball of yarn. "Tell me," Asha whispered, "that those are warnings." "They're warnings," Park said. "Tell me what they're warning about." Nobody answered her. They found the cage at the bottom of the corridor. It was a sphere, 200 meters across, by Myra's helmet readout, suspended in the middle of a chamber so vast their lights could not find the walls. The sphere was not solid. It was a lattice of something that looked like glass and behaved like fog, and inside it, curled, was the thing from the panels. It was sleeping. Or it had been sleeping. It was, Myra understood with the slow certainty of a person watching a glass tip off a counter, no longer sleeping. The fan of feelers around its head was moving, slowly, the way a sleeper's hand moves when a fly lands on it. "Out," Halvorsen said. "Calm, calm the way men are calm when the building is on fire and the children are still inside. Out, now, all of you, move." They moved. They did not move fast enough. The thing in the sphere opened one eye. The eye was the size of Myra's chest. It was not an eye the way a human eye is an eye. It was a slit of color in the dark, gold and wet and very, very old, and it looked at them and it knew them, and Myra felt, for the second time in her life, a hand on her belly. Then the sphere came apart. It did not break. It came apart. It unraveled like a sweater pulled by a child, and the lattice of fog glass dissolved into the air, and the thing inside uncurled and stood up, and it was bigger than the chamber, and the chamber was a kilometer wide. Halvorsen got off 2 shots before it took him. It did not eat him. It did not crush him. It touched him. One feeler, no thicker than Myra's wrist, came down out of the dark and brushed the front of his helmet, very gently, the way you might touch a moth to see if it was alive. The visor of the helmet went white. Then it went red. Then Halvorsen was not in the helmet anymore. There was no body. There was no blood. There was just the helmet, falling very slowly in the low gravity, ringing once on the floor. Park screamed. Park ran. Park made it 8 meters before the second feeler found him. It went on like that. Myra did not run. She could not have said why. Her legs would not move. She stood with her back against the wall of the chamber and watched the thing pick her crewmates out of the dark one by one, as carefully as a woman picking herbs, and she heard herself, from very far away, begin to hum. Her grandmother's lullaby. The tune without the words. The thing stopped. It stopped in the middle of reaching for Asha. Asha was on the floor on her back, her rifle empty, her hand up in the universal gesture of please. The feeler hung in the air above her, trembling, the way a dog's nose trembles at a scent it does not know. Then the great gold eye turned. It turned slowly, the way a moon turns, and it found Myra against the wall, and it looked at her, and she went on humming because she could not think of anything else to do, and the feeler that had been about to touch Asha moved away from Asha and came across the room and stopped a meter from Myra's face. It did not touch her. It hung there in the dark, and it listened. Myra hummed the lullaby through to the end. Then, because she did not know what else to do, she hummed it again. Her hands were shaking. Her bladder had let go some minutes ago and she had not noticed. She kept humming. The thing made a sound. It was not a roar. It was not a hiss. It was a low, slow note, deep enough that Myra felt it in her teeth, and she would never be able to explain this to anyone later, and she would stop trying. It was the same note, the same lullaby, one bar of it, hummed back to her in a voice the size of a cathedral. Then it lowered the feeler. It lowered it the way an old man lowers himself into a chair, carefully, as if its bones hurt. The tip of it touched the floor at Myra's feet, and then, very slowly, it touched the toe of her boot. She did not move. It touched her knee. She did not move. It touched her belly, and held there. The great gold eye closed. The feeler stayed against her belly, very gently, the way Diego had touched her belly the morning he found out, before he had known to be afraid. And the thing in the dark, the thing that had unmade 4 people in the time it took to draw a breath, made a sound that Myra understood at the bottom of some animal part of herself to be grief. It knew. She did not know how, but it knew. About the thing inside her, about the 7-week thing that was not yet a person and not yet not, and it grieved. Myra put her hand on the feeler. It was warm, not sun-warm, body warm, the same warmth as the door. "Hello," she said. The feeler trembled. "It's okay," she said, "the way you talk to a horse, the way you talk to a dog that has been beaten. It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you." A second feeler came down, and a third. They did not touch her. They surrounded her the way a hand cups a candle in a wind. And the great gold eye opened again and looked at her, and Myra understood without language, without anything that could be put in a report, that she was being seen. Not scanned, not assessed, seen. The way her grandmother had seen her, on the kitchen floor with the Bible burning between them. Behind her, Asha made a small sound. Asha was sitting up. Asha was alive. "Don't move," Myra said without turning. "Don't move, Ash, just be very still." "What is it doing?" "It's saying hello." Asha began, very quietly, to cry. The first contact between humanity and the apex predator of the local arm of the galaxy lasted 4 hours and 17 minutes, and was conducted entirely in the dark, and was witnessed by one woman with a wet flight suit and one woman with an empty rifle, and consisted, almost in its entirety, of a single bar of a Colombian lullaby, hummed back and forth between 2 species that should not have been able to hear each other. They named it Abuela. Asha named it. Myra had refused to name it for 2 days on the grounds that it was not hers to name, and Asha had finally said, "Myra, if I have to keep calling it the thing, I am going to lose my mind." And Myra had thought about it and said, "Abuela, grandmother." Asha had not laughed. Asha had not argued. Asha had just nodded, the way you nod when someone tells you the name of a child. Abuela could not fit in their ship. Abuela could barely fit in the chamber where they had found her, but Abuela could shrink. That was the second thing Myra learned. The thing in the cage was not the thing. The thing was much larger than the cage, and much larger than the chamber, and the part of her that had filled the sphere had been only the part she had chosen to show. When she wanted to walk beside Myra in the corridor, she could be the size of a horse. When she wanted to rest in Myra's lap, she could be the size of a cat. She chose the size of a cat mostly. She seemed to like Myra's lap. The third thing Myra learned was harder. There were panels in the corridor that Havorson had not let them stop for. Asha and Myra stopped for them now. They photographed everyone. They sat in the dark with their helmets in their laps, and they looked at the pictures on the screens. And Asha, who had a doctorate in xenolinguistics and had spent 6 years on a translation team that had never had anything to translate, began slowly to read. The panels were a court record. Abuela had been tried. By whom, the panels did not say, or said it in a way the women could not yet parse. But she had been tried, and she had been convicted, and her sentence had been to sleep in the cage on the rock around the bruised star, alone, for what the panels rendered as a number with 11 digits. Her crime, as best as Asha could make out, was kindness. "That can't be right," Myra said. That's what it says. Read it again. HFY read it again. The word was not exactly kindness. The word, as best as HFY could render it, was, she fed the small ones who were not meant to be fed. Myra sat with that for a long time. The small ones, she said finally. Yes. Like us. HFY looked at her. HFY did not say anything. HFY in Myra's lap, Abuela uncoiled one feeler and very gently, very deliberately touched the screen. The image on it was a planet. Blue, white swirled, familiar. The feeler tapped the planet once, the way a finger taps a name. Oh, Myra said. She put her face in her hands. 4 billion years ago, something had come to Earth and seeded it. Nobody knew who. Myra knew now. You did it, she said into her hands. You did it, you made us. The feeler touched her hair. And they locked you up for it. The feeler trembled, the way it had trembled when it first touched her belly, and Myra understood that she was, for the second time in a week, sitting with a grieving god. They had buried what was left of the others that first morning. There had not been much to bury. Myra and HFY had gathered the helmets, Havorsons, Parks, Brennans, Vosses, and laid them in a row at the foot of the canyon wall, and they had piled stones over them, and HFY had said a prayer in 3 languages, and Myra had said nothing because she could not think of anything that would not be a lie. Abuela had watched. Abuela, by then about the size of a large dog, had sat very still on a rock with her feelers folded around her like a shawl, and her great gold eye had blinked once slowly when HFY finished the prayer. Myra understood, although she could not have said how she understood, that Abuela was grieving with them, not for the dead, for the killing, the way a dog grieves when it has bitten someone it loves. It wasn't your fault, Myra said quietly, after HFY had walked back to the lander. The great gold eye looked at her. They came in with rifles up. You were asleep, you didn't know. The feelers trembled again. Abuela, look at me. You did not do a bad thing, you did a frightened thing. There is a difference. Whether the creature understood the words or only the tone, Myra could not say, but the feelers stopped trembling, and after a long moment the great small head came down and pressed, very gently, against Myra's shoulder and stayed there, and Myra put her hand up and held it, and that was the moment, she would think later, that she stopped being a medic on a failed mission and started being something else. Something the human language did not yet have a word for. A grandmother's keeper. A door between worlds. Over the next week she learned the shape of the creature she had befriended. Abuela did not eat. Abuela did not sleep exactly, although she rested. Abuela could not speak human language but could understand intent, the way a very smart animal understands intent, and could project, into the part of Myra that was older than language, images and impressions and sometimes, rarely, single-freighted words. The first word she ever projected was, alone. The second was, long. The third, on the 4th night, when Myra was sitting on the lander floor with a hand on her belly because the small thing had started to flutter, was, yours. Myra had cried at that. She had not cried for the dead, she cried for that. HFY worked the panels every day. HFY was, Myra understood, doing the only thing HFY knew how to do, which was to read. She read for 10 hours at a stretch. She came back to the lander hoarse and hollow-eyed and full of fragments, names that had no reference, dates that had no calendar, a long list of crimes for which the sentence had been the cage. Most of the crimes HFY could not parse. One she could. The one about feeding the small ones who were not meant to be fed. There's more, HFY said on the 7th night, sitting cross-legged on the lander floor with her tablet in her lap. Myra, there's more. More what? More others like her. HFY turned the tablet around. The panel on the screen showed 3 of the creatures, 3, curled around 3 different worlds. She wasn't alone. There were others. They did the same thing, the same crime. And there. Cage same as her, different rocks, different stars. But the same sentence. Myra looked at the tablet for a long time. She looked at the three worlds. She thought about the one she had come from, and the brown wave, and the warm rain, and how many other small ones, scattered across the galaxy, might be coughing under a sky the wrong color because their grandmothers had been locked up for the crime of making them. Shall. Yeah. When we get home. I know. We're not just going home, we're. I know, Myra. They did not say it out loud. They did not need to. Abuela uncoiled from Myra's shoulder and slid across the floor and put one feeler on the tablet, on the image of one of the other caged ones, and the feeler trembled, and Abuela made the low, slow note that Myra had come to understand was her closest approximation of a name. Yes, Myra said, her too. The ship in the sky came on the 11th day. It did not announce itself. It did not need to. It darkened the sun, and the sun was already a bruise, and Myra walked out of the corridor with Abuela coiled around her shoulders the size of a scarf and looked up and saw it and knew, the way she had known the lullaby, what it was. The jailers had come back to check on the prisoner. The ship was the color of bone. It had no windows. It had no engines that Myra could see. It hung above the canyon the way a verdict hangs over a courtroom, and from its underside there began to come down a light, and the light was very white, and the light was searching. Abuela uncoiled from Myra's shoulders. Abuela grew. By the time Abuela's feet touched the canyon floor, she was the size of a house, and then the size of a city block, and then the size of the cathedral in Bogota where Myra's grandmother had been married. And Abuela's great gold eye looked up at the ship, and Abuela made a sound that was not the lullaby. It was a sound Myra had never heard her make. It was the sound of a creature that had been in a cage for 11 billion years, and had been let out by a stranger, and had decided, in the time it took a human to hum 8 bars of music, that the stranger was hers. It was a sound, Myra realized with a kind of slow wonder, of love. And then Abuela attacked the ship. It is not easy to describe a fight between two things that are not made of the same physics. Myra tried later, in the report she would never be allowed to file. She wrote that the ship of bone opened along seams she had not seen, and from the seams came things that were not creatures exactly, but were not weapons exactly, either long pale shapes that moved through the air the way ink moves through water. She wrote that Abuela met them. She wrote that the canyon filled with a light that had no color, and that the air smelled of ozone and antiseptic and very faintly of her grandmother's kitchen. She wrote that she watched a being older than the earth fight for her, and her child and Asha, against the law of a galaxy they had not known existed. She wrote that Abuela was losing. She did not write what she did next, because she did not have words for it. What she did was this. She walked out into the middle of the canyon, under the white searching light, with Asha shouting her name behind her, and she put her hands up, and she began again to hum. The lullaby. The same 8 bars. The light stopped moving. The pale shapes in the air paused. Abuela paused. Everything paused. And Myra stood in the middle of a canyon on a planet around a bruised star, with her hands up and her flight suit stiff and her 7-week child curled inside her, and she hummed a Colombian lullaby at a ship full of judges that had condemned her grandmother to 11 billion years of solitude for the crime of making her. The ship spoke. It did not speak in words. It spoke in the same way Abuela spoke directly into the part of Myra that was older than language. It said in effect this: "Step aside, small one. The prisoner is ours. The sentence is not complete." Myra did not step aside. She said, also without words, also into the part of herself that was older than language, "She is mine." The ship considered. This took a long time, long enough for Myra to feel the cold of the canyon floor through her boots, long enough for Asha to come up beside her and take her hand, long enough for Abuela behind them to shrink very slowly, very deliberately back down to the size of a cat, and to climb up Myra's leg, and to curl around her shoulders, and to put her great gold eye against the side of Myra's face. Then the ship spoke again. It said, "You do not know what you are protecting." Myra said, "I know exactly what I am protecting." The ship said, "She is killed." Myra said, "So have I." The ship said, "She is not of your kind." And Myra, who had watched her grandmother burn a Bible to keep her warm, and who had watched her crew die in the dark, and who had been touched on the belly by a god, Myra laughed. It was a small laugh. It was not unkind. It was the laugh of a woman who has been asked, very seriously, whether water is wet. She said, "She made my kind." The ship was silent for a long time after that. Then the white light went out. The pale shapes in the air drew back into the seams of the ship. The seams closed. The ship rose very slowly, the way a verdict is sometimes withdrawn. It did not say goodbye. It did not say anything. It went up through the bruised sky and it was gone, and the canyon was quiet, and the wind came back, and on Myra's shoulder Abuela began, very quietly, to purr. That is not the word for the sound she made. There is no word for the sound she made, but it was the closest thing. Asha sat down on the canyon floor. Asha put her head between her knees. Asha said into the dirt, did we just win?" Myra did not answer. Myra was looking at the sky. She was thinking about Earth, about the brown wave, about the warm rain, about Diego, who would not be on the ground much longer, and her mother, who had stopped opening the windows, and the 7 billion people who were eating themselves alive on a planet whose soil had forgotten how to grow. She put her hand up to her shoulder. Abuela pressed her great small head into Myra's palm. "Abuela," Myra said, "can you fix it?" The feeler trembled. "The planet I came from, can you fix it?" The great gold eye opened. It looked at Myra. It looked, Myra thought, a little tired. It looked the way her own grandmother had looked the night of the Bible when the pages had run out and the cold had still been in the room. But it nodded. Myra had not known it could nod. It nodded, once, the way a grandmother nods when you ask her to tell you a story she has told you 100 times. They went home in the lander. The math should not have worked. The fuel should not have lasted. The jump back through the wormhole should have killed them both and the baby besides. None of it killed them. The lander went up through the bruised sky, and Abuela rode coiled around Myra's seat like a sleeping cat. And when they reached the place where space folded, Abuela uncoiled just for a moment, just long enough to put one feeler against the hull, and the hull, Myra watched this and would never be able to explain it, went transparent. Not gone, transparent. And on the other side of the transparency was not space, was not the wormhole. Was a long, soft dark, full of the smell of her grandmother's kitchen, and a humming that was not quite the lullaby but was its older sister. And they went through the dark like a stone goes through water, and they came out the other side over the blue-white swirl of earth, and Abuela coiled back around Myra's shoulder and went, very quietly, back to sleep. Asha cried. Asha cried for a long time. Myra did not cry. Myra looked down at the planet that was dying and held the small warm weight on her shoulder and thought calmly, the way you think when the world is being given back to you. Good timing. They did not let her land in Houston. They did not let her land anywhere at first. The lander hung in low orbit for 11 hours while men on the ground tried to decide whether the thing on her shoulder was a weapon. Myra told them, over the radio, in a voice that did not shake, that the thing on her shoulder was her grandmother, and that her grandmother had come to fix the trees, and that if they shot her down, they would be killing the last best chance the species had, and also a pregnant woman, and also a cat. She used the word cat on purpose. She had learned in the canyon that the word you used for a thing changed how people saw it. Abuela was, for the purposes of the United Nations Emergency Council, a cat. They let her land in a field outside Brasilia. There were tanks. There were biohazard suits. There were 3 men with the authority to order her killed and 1 woman, very old, with the authority to override them. The old woman walked across the field alone. She had been a botanist once. She had spent 40 years watching the trees die. She came up to the open door of the lander and she looked at Myra, and she looked at the small coiled shape on Myra's shoulder, and she said in Portuguese, "Is it true?" Myra said, "Yes." The old woman said, "Show me." Myra stepped out of the lander. She walked across the field. The grass under her boots was the brown of old tea. She knelt down, and she put her hand on the ground, and Abuela uncoiled from her shoulder and slid down her arm and put one feeler against the dirt. Nothing happened for a long time. Then the grass under Myra's hand went green. Not all at once. The way a blush comes up a throat, the way a stain spreads in cloth, a circle of green, the size of a dinner plate, then the size of a table, then the size of the field. The brown wave that had crossed continents, going backward, going home. The old woman sat down on the ground. The old woman put her face in her hands. The old woman did not cry the way a shack cried. She cried the way a person cries when they have been holding their breath for 40 years. Behind her, the tanks did not move. The men in the biohazard suits did not move. They watched the grass come green under a woman from a dying species, and a creature that the rest of the galaxy had locked in a cage for 11 billion years for the crime of feeding the small ones who were not meant to be fed. It took 11 months to fix the planet. It would take longer to fix everything else. The autoimmune disease did not go away overnight. The atmospheres did not balance in a day. There were 3 wars and 1 attempted assassination, and a great deal of theological adjustment that the world's religions handled with varying degrees of grace. But the trees came back. The plankton came back. The rain came back cold and clean and tasting of nothing. The way it happened was this. Abuela could not heal a planet by walking across it. The planet was too big, and she was, even at her largest, a finite thing. What she could do was teach. She could touch a seed and the seed remembered. She could touch a strain of plankton and the plankton remembered. The instructions she carried in whatever passed for her body were the same instructions she had laid down 4 billion years ago, and the soil and the sea and the slow green chemistry of the world recognized them the way a child recognizes a mother's voice through a closed door. So Myra and Asha and a small team of botanists, Myra's father's old colleagues, the ones who had stood in the rain in Manaus and lived through it, flew with Abuela from continent to continent in a small unmarked plane that the new emergency council had given them. They landed in fields. They landed in dead forests. They landed once on a glacier that had not been a glacier for 15 years, and Abuela touched the bare rock and a moss came up under her feeler the color of new copper, and the botanists wept like children. There was a small ceremony in Manaus. Myra insisted on it. They flew in low over what had been the rainforest and was now a brown plain pocked with the bones of trees, and they landed at the edge of a clearing where her father had once worked, and Myra walked out onto the bare ground with Abuela coiled around her shoulder. She did not say anything. She knelt down. She put her hand on the dirt. Abuela slid down her arm and put one feeler on the dirt next to her hand, and Myra closed her eyes and she said in her head, in the part of her that was older than language, this was his. He loved it. He died for it. Give it back to him. The feeler trembled. Then the ground under their hands began, very slowly, to remember. The botanists, who were watching from the plane with the door open, said later that they had seen a wave of green move out from under Myra's hand and cross the clearing and disappear into the distance at a speed that should not have been possible, and that some of them had fallen to their knees, and that one of them, an old man who had not prayed since he was 8, had begun to pray, and that nobody had said anything for a long time after. Myra had not seen the wave. Myra had only felt, with her eyes closed, a hand on her own shoulder, not Abuela's, not a hand she could place, the hand of someone who had wanted for a long time to come home and had finally been let in. She had not told anyone about that hand, not even Asha, Some things were not for the report. There was a moment, that same week, walking back to the plane through the bare trees with Abuela coiled around her shoulder, when Myra had stopped and looked up. The sky over Manaus had been brown her whole life. It had been brown her father's whole life. It was that afternoon, still brown. The green wave moved fast on the ground, but the air took longer, and Myra had stood under that brown sky with her hand on Abuela's small great head and had said, in a voice so quiet the botanists in the plane could not have heard her, "We're going to fix the sky too, aren't we?" And Abuela had hummed once very low in her chest, and Myra had understood. Yes, yes, give us a little time, yes. In the second month she went to Toronto, where the autoimmune was worst, and Abuela touched the water supply of a city of 9 million people, and the people did not stop being sick that day, but their children, born after, were not sick. That was enough. That was, the news anchors said with the particular voice news anchors use when they have been crying off camera, more than enough. She went to Lagos in the same week, and to Karachi, and to Jakarta. The crowds in those cities were enormous and almost entirely silent. People had brought their children. People held them up the way people in older centuries had held babies up to be blessed. Myra had not known what to do with that the first time. She had wanted to tell them she was not a saint, that she was a woman with sore feet and a colicky 6-month-old at home, and a creature on her shoulder she did not entirely understand. But Abuela had understood. Abuela had uncoiled from Myra's shoulder and slid down, and moved through the crowd at the height of a child's reach, and the great gold eye had blinked once at each small face, and the people had touched her, and she had let them, and Myra had watched a god learn, in real time, the shape of a kind of love she had not been allowed to feel in 11 billion years. In the third month, a man with a rifle tried to kill her in a parking lot in Atlanta. He believed Abuela was the Antichrist. He had written about it at length on the internet. He had brought his 14-year-old son with him, on the theory that this would be a thing the boy would remember. The boy had remembered it, but not the way the father had intended. The father had raised the rifle, and Abuela, who had spent 11 billion years in a cage and had killed 4 humans in the time it took to draw a breath, Abuela had done nothing. She had simply coiled tighter around Myra's shoulder and pressed her great small head against Myra's cheek and waited. Myra had looked at the man over the barrel of the rifle and had not moved. The man had stood there for what Myra's bodyguard said later was 4 full seconds, an eternity, the rifle shaking in his hands, and then he had lowered it, and then he had sat down on the asphalt and put his face in his hands, and his son had walked across the parking lot to Myra and asked, in a small voice, if he could touch her grandmother. Myra had said yes. The boy had put his hand on Abuela's head. Abuela had purred, the sound that was not quite a purr, and the boy had laughed, the way a child laughs when a horse breathes on his palm, and that photograph, the boy, the laugh, the great gold eye half closed, had gone around the world in an hour. After that there were fewer rifles. In the 5th month Asha left. She did not leave for good. She left for a mission. 6 caged ones, the panels had said in the end, scattered across the local arm, 6 grandmothers, 6 worlds, 6 brown waves crossing 6 skies. The new council put together a ship. Asha went on it. She came to say goodbye in a hotel room in Bogota, and she sat on the edge of Myra's bed and she said, in her quiet way, "I'm going to go let some other grandmothers out." Myra had nodded. Myra had said, "Be careful." "I will." "Bring them home." "I will." Asha had looked at Myra for a long time, the way Asha looked at things she was filing for later, and then she had said, "It's funny, isn't it? The crime is the cure. The whole galaxy locked them up for it. And the whole galaxy has been dying ever since, slow, the way ours was dying, because the grandmothers stopped feeding the small ones." Myra had not said anything. Myra had only thought about how many planets were out there with brown waves crossing them. How many small ones, eating themselves alive, under skies they did not know were the wrong color. How many great gold eyes in cages, listening for someone to hum the right tune. Go, she had said finally, go feed them. Asha had hugged her. Asha had walked out. Myra had not seen her again for 2 years. In the 7th month, Myra had her baby in a hospital in Bogota, with a substitute friend holding her hand, and Diego, who had not died after all. Diego, who had been pulled off the failing list the morning the grass went green, sitting by the window with his head in his hands. The baby was a girl. The baby was healthy. The baby came out screaming, the way human babies do, and Myra laughed through the exhaustion and the blood and said the name she had chosen on the long ride home through the dark. Lucia Light. Abuela was in the room. Abuela was the size of a cat. Abuela climbed up onto the bed when the nurses had gone, and Abuela coiled very carefully around the baby's small warm body, and Abuela made the sound that was not quite a purr and not quite a lullaby, and the baby, who had been crying, went quiet and looked up with the unfocused eyes of a thing that has just arrived, and Myra watched her daughter meet her grandmother for the first time and thought, this is what they locked her up for. This, right here, this was the crime. The ship of bone came back once. Myra was 41. Lucia was 13. They were standing on a beach in Valparaiso, watching a sky that had stopped being the color of tea and had remembered slowly how to be blue. Abuela was coiled in the sand at their feet, the size of a beach ball, half asleep. Lucia was barefoot. Lucia had her mother's hair and her father's mouth and the long, slow eyes of a child who had grown up sleeping with a god curled around her crib, and was, Myra thought, watching her draw circles in the sand with one toe, entirely unafraid of anything. There had been a long argument in the early years about whether that was good for the child, whether a child should grow up unafraid. The therapists had worried about it. Diego had worried about it. Myra had not worried. Myra had grown up afraid of everything in the gray years, and she had decided, somewhere on a canyon floor with her hands up under a white searching light, that she was raising a daughter who would never know what that was like. And the ship of bone came down out of orbit and hung over the water, and the white searching light came on, and Myra sighed, the way you sigh when an in-law comes to visit, and she stood up, and she put her hands on her hips. She did not hum this time. She did not need to. She said out loud in Spanish because she was tired and her feet hurt, "She is still mine. The sentence is still not complete. Go home." The ship considered. Then it said, into the part of her that was older than language, this, "We have been watching." Myra said, "I know." The ship said, "You have done," and here it used a word that Asha, when Myra described it to her later, said had no good translation, but that meant, roughly, something between the words tending and gardening and grace. "You have done this with her." Myra said, "She did most of it." The ship said, "She could not have done it alone. She has tried. 11 billion years she has tried. She could not until you. Why could she with you?" Myra thought about this for a while. Lucia came up beside her and took her hand. Abuela in the sand opened one gold eye. "Because we asked," Myra said. The ship was silent. "You never asked her to come back," Myra said. "You judged her and you locked her up and you forgot her. We asked her, I asked her, on a canyon floor with my hands up, and she said yes. Maybe that's all it ever takes." The ship was silent for a long time. Then it said slowly, as if it were choosing each word against a long resistance, "We made an error." Myra had not expected that. Myra looked at the ship for a long moment. Then she said also slowly, "Yes, you did." The ship said, "There are others, 5 others in cages." "I know." The ship said, "Your friend is releasing them." "I know." The ship said, "We will not stop her." Myra let out a breath she had been holding for several years. "Thank you," she said. The ship said, "We will not help her either. The error was ours. The correction is yours. We will watch. We will not interfere. This is the only apology we know how to make." Myra understood, in the part of herself that was older than language, that for whatever had built the ship of bone, whatever ancient assembly of judges and recorders that had been keeping the books of the galaxy for longer than there had been a galaxy worth keeping books about. This was an enormous thing to say. It was a thing they had perhaps never said before. It was, in the only language they had, sorry. She nodded once. "Watch carefully," she said. "We're going to feed all of them." The white light went out. The ship rose, very slowly, back into the blue sky that had remembered how to be blue, and it was gone. It did not say goodbye. But Myra understood, in the part of her that was older than language, that something in the ship, some judge, some recorder, some old machine that had been keeping the books for 11 billion years, had, for the first time in its long career, written a word in the margin of a closed file. The word was pardoned. Myra walked back to her family. Lucia squeezed her hand. Abuela climbed up Myra's leg and coiled around her shoulder, the size of a cat, and pressed her great small head against Myra's cheek and began, very quietly, to hum. The lullaby. The same 8 bars. Myra hummed back. And on a beach in Valparaiso, under a sky that had remembered how to be blue, a woman and her grandmother and her daughter walked home along the wet sand, and behind them the tide came in over the prints of their feet, and the sea was full, and the sea was clean, and the sea was loud with the sound of things that were alive. The galaxy's deadliest apex predator had escaped its cage. A human had decided to pet it. And the universe, for the first time in 11 billion years, had been wrong about who was dangerous and who was kind.